We're going to talk about real-time chat today and real-time messaging. And one of the reasons why I think this is one of the best things you could possibly tune into today is that we've seen a lot of changes in behavior and adoption of technology over the last couple of months or year. So that's going to be the first part that we're going to talk about in the session. The second part we're going to talk about is how that behavior is being steered by human instinct and the way that we behave as social creatures. Finally, at step 3, we're going to look at how you can use those behaviors and create the best user experience and the best outcomes for your users. And finally, we'll look at how to implement that in code. So to get started, I think that it is incredibly exciting, next to all the things that were very much not exciting, of course, but from a technological perspective, we've seen a lot of magical things happen in the last year. One milestone that we reached quite recently is that we now passed 3.8 billion smartphones on the planet. And that just blows my mind away. Like, I remember not that long ago, there was only 2 billion. That doubled in that time. And humanity has built this globe-spanning network of 4 billion connected people and all the compute resources required to make that experience possible. Now, if it wasn't for the fact that this was not nearly done yet, I would say that this would almost qualify as one of the new world wonders. One of the other cool things that we've seen is that a lot of the trends that were already growing slowly year over year accelerated tremendously. And one of the things that you could look at is online grocery shopping and delivery. That grew tremendously, and now 30% of the population is using online grocery systems. 10% of the population using it for the very first time in the last year. You see the same kind of behavior if you look at other places in e-commerce. Like, e-commerce itself jumped from 20% to 30% of the addressable retail market. And of course, that excludes restaurants and supermarkets. But all the online shopping jumped up at a major factor. Hi, Markiva. Then next, if we look at what happens with chat applications, because of course we're talking about chat today, if we're looking at all the different top-rated chat applications, so that's WeChat, Line, Facebook Messenger, and all those other ones, combined, they have over 6 billion accounts registered. Now, of course, this is not 6 billion people because people have accounts on multiple services, but it's a very good bet that most of those 4 billion people with smartphones also have an account on one or more chat applications. And that has an impact, and especially, of course, over the last year, where we want to reach out to people digitally more than ever before, because it at least allows us to connect to the people around us. One of the magical things happened, that we jumped from 25% of the adults in the UK and the US making a video call once a week to 75% of all adults. That is mainstream adoption. That is blowing it away. This is now the new normal. So when you add all of those things up, you're looking at something that normally would have taken 5 or 10 years. And that happened in the last year. That is major. That is massive. That is incredible. So of course that has an impact, right? If you base your assumptions on what the world looked like a year ago, then you're missing out on all the things that have happened around us in our ecosystem, in the technological space. And I'm finding a cat here in the background. I apologize. So one of the things that powers that, of course, is that we're human beings and we love to connect to other human beings. And there's a reason for that. If we look at our hardware, our brain in our head, large chunks of it are dedicated to social behavior and social relationships. And yes, the kitty does want to be part of the conversation. She's very social as well. So our brain, of course, language centers is an obvious part of it, but there's also all these instincts that drive how we interact with other human beings. And that is something we're not always fully aware of, but it is something that everyone has in all their behaviors. And the interesting thing that happened is that many of those behaviors have translated to the online experience as well. One of the quirks of the human brain is that it takes a very long time for it to physically evolve and change. So the couple of years that this kind of technological behavior has been available to us, our brain has not adapted to it yet. So everything that we see happening in the digital world gets interpreted by our social parts of our brain as if it was a real world interaction between two flesh and bone human beings. The brain does not see a difference between those two. So I wanted to take a look at some of these interactions and instincts and then see how those apply to the online experience and how you can create that inflection in your brain where it goes, hey, this is another human being, and that is going to guide how I'm going to interact with them. So one of my favorite stories of an experiment they did was with daycare centers in Israel. And daycare centers in Israel had the same problem that daycare centers everyone has. And that is that parents are always late to pick up their children. And it makes sense, right? Like maybe a meeting is running late, or maybe you got stuck in traffic. Whole bunch of stuff can happen to you. So you don't even mean to be late, but stuff happens. Now, for the staff, that's not ideal because that means they can't go home and when their work shift is ended, right? So that's not great. And they figured, you know what? We are going to do an experiment and we're going to try the classic economic approach where we are going to incentivize people to be in time by fining them if they're late. And to see if this works, we're going to take 10 daycare centers. 4 of those we're going to use as a control group, and we're not going to change anything. But that's how we can compare the results and see if there's a change in the other behavior. And with 6 of those, we're going to find every parent that is late picking up their children. Now, the weird thing that happened is that the behavior in those 4 centers, apologies, the behavior in those 4 centers did not change at all. In the 6 centers where they started finding parents, they were more late more often. And that's weird, right? That's the opposite of what you expect to see if you're finding people to try to change the behavior. So the weird thing that happened is that they forgot that as human beings, we possess a lot of empathy. We can imagine that there's people working there who are unable to go home, and we feel bad about that. Even if we don't consciously consider that, it is something that drives our behavior, and that sense of empathy and guilt makes us try to be as early as possible and try to be there in time. The moment you could pay them for it to be okay that they were late, all that guilt, all that empathy went away. And they went, hey, you know what? I'm going to be an hour late, and that's fine. I'll just pay the fine, and everyone's going to be happy. The really interesting thing is that after that experiment went on for a whole bunch of weeks, I think it was about 2 months, they tried to change that back again. And they stopped finding parents, but the behavior remained unchanged. People still were much later, much more frequently than they were before. The moment that contract was broken between the people who were in the daycare center and the parents of the children, it was impossible to easily fix that again. Another story that shows how our human behavior influences everything that we're doing. I'm looking at the chat. Someone needs a pin code for an open talk challenge. I think you were in the wrong room, VJ. I'm so sorry. Anyway, so there was this experiment where they took a student, they put him in a room, and they gave him $10. And they said, someone's going to come in the room with you, and you're going to make an offer. If they accept that offer, you both keep whatever amount you agree to. So you can choose to share it 50-50. You could take $9 yourself. Whatever people agree to, that's going to be the outcome. However, if they refuse your offer, then neither of you gets anything. My apologies, that's bad timing, but that's Murphy Law for you. So the weird thing that happened is that if the offer that was made was less than what we felt was reasonable, yes, thank you, Rolando. If that offer was less than reasonable, the other party rejected it, even though that meant they wouldn't get any money at all. And the classic economic perspective would have been $1 is better than $0. But our human instinct doesn't think that that's the right way for people to interact with each other in a society. So whenever people behave in a way that we think is not permitted within the boundaries of what we consider civility, we will correct their course of action, even at the expense of our own experience. And that's powerful. That means that there's this almost self healing nature in groups of people where people will always do their best to make sure that the best possible agreements and social interactions exist between them. Another fun experiment was when an airport decided that they had an issue where everyone was ignoring the signs for how large their carry-on luggage could be. And of course, you get into problems because it doesn't fit in the overhead bins. And we've probably all been on airplanes, so we know what that looks like. So they did an experiment where they took a photo of a person, they printed it out as a life-sized thing, they put that thing in place of that sign, and it was a person holding a sign, a photo of a person holding a sign. And suddenly everyone started paying attention to it, where just the sign by itself with just the text was completely ignored. The photo of a person triggered that human connection in our brain. It made us consider the social connections between human beings, even though it wasn't a human being. And I find that fascinating. So, one of the key takeaways for me with all of these stories is that as human beings, as long as we get these signals that tell our brain to interpret this as a social situation with other human beings that we care about, we change and moderate our behavior tremendously. And of course, it is far more gratifying for us as well, because as human beings, we love social engagement. Now, many of these stories might sound a bit out there. Maybe you don't recognize this in your own life. So, one of my other favorite examples that everyone who drives a car has probably experienced is that when you're in a car and someone cuts across from you, it is perfectly okay to shout at them loudly, favorously. If, on the other hand, someone would cut you off on the sidewalk as you're walking, you might stare at them with a bit of objection in your eyes, but you would never shout at them or say anything, right? So the same interpretation of your brain happens in those situations as well, where if it's a person in a car, it's an entity, it is not a human being. If, on the other hand, you meet people without that barrier of the car in the way, suddenly we modify our behavior again. So, looking at those stories and looking at the lessons that we can learn from there, we can start applying a whole bunch of those to how we engage with online communication as well. And one of the magical things I think is that as communications evolved over time, you could argue that it sort of started with the fax machine digital communication. Because, that sent digital photos to other machines that printed it out, but it was in a way correspondence, and correspondence doesn't give us a sense of being connected to a human being. Email, of course, is only a much fancier version of exactly the same principle of correspondence. It is not a direct connection to a human being. It feels much more like you're shouting at a car. So, chat, for some reason, triggers those social cues that allow us to understand that you're engaging live with a human being. And one of the big changes in the chat experience from the original text messages that we had on our feature phones to chat today is that we've added a lot of social cues to those interactions. And of course, you have something like the typing indicator, those little dots that animates. That is a placeholder to mimic what we do in normal conversation. When you're talking to someone else or you're not done talking yet, you use and those are fillers to indicate that you are not done talking yet. So, because when you're listening to someone and they go quiet, that is an indication that that's your point of jumping in and continuing the conversation. Whereas if you use filler words or gestures, then they know it's not my time yet, they're just thinking. So the typing indicator is the digital equivalent of that. Similarly, an online indication gives you the idea that you're directly connected to a person who is seeing you type in real time. And likewise, things like delivery notifications add a whole bunch of clues to your brain as well to understand the social context of the situation that you're currently in. And those things combined fundamentally change how we react to it. It is exactly the difference between sitting in a car or meeting someone on the sidewalk. So when you send email to people, it's the car situation. When you're chatting with someone real time, suddenly it's a human being to human being connection. And all those instincts we talked about earlier suddenly come into play. Your behavior changes fundamentally. Now, you can apply that in all kinds of ways. A marketplace, for instance, is a great thing to have, like the scalability of that and being able to find interesting deals further away than just the market around the corner is a tremendous technological achievement that makes your life so much better. But of course, if you don't meet those people in person, it's very easy to mistrust them. Like they're a city away, you have no idea who they are. And if you're just looking at their webpage with a description again, it's an entity. You don't trust it. You don't have a relationship with it. If, on the other hand, you can connect with them through chats or video calls or any other means, suddenly they're human beings. And we trust human beings, generally speaking. We don't trust entities. So that sense of trust tremendously uplifts the amount of sales that happen on these kind of platforms. The same kind of behavior we see in communities, like if you're on Reddit or Twitter, then you know that one of the favorite activities for people to do there is to argue with each other vehemently. And it's entertaining, right? And again, these are the engagements where those social behaviors do not come into play. But if you add chat to that environment and where people can connect to each other, like Reddit did, and they use Sandberg for that, then suddenly the engagement shoots up because you're connecting with other human beings and not just arguing on hypothetical abstract concepts. And increased their engagement for, I think it was about 8%, one of the largest increases in engagement they've ever seen. So that's a big deal. Having those kind of communities connecting with each other makes a very big difference. Now, the other interesting thing that happens is that the stickiness of communities becomes an incredibly important thing as well. Sorry, I should stop looking at the chat, even though I'm talking about chat here, but that's a good point, Bill. Anyway, so if you look at something like games, like I'm the kind of guy who grew up playing World of Warcraft and actually ended up leading raids in the guilds, which means you have to get 30 people who all have different schedules and different motivations to come together online at the same time in a coordinated fashion and then do something together, which requires quite a few technical skills in how you're playing that game. Now, that in itself was an incredible experience. It was a lot of fun. But even when that became boring for people, people would keep logging in because that was the world where their friends were, right? This is where you were hanging out with your friends, with the people you knew. And in many ways, it became a replacement for a shopping mall or a coffee shop, far more than it was just a game. Now, recently, a number of other people noticed this as well when other massive games like Fortnite became the place for Generation Z, so the younger generation around their teens to early 20s. They started playing Fortnite by the many, many millions. Sorry. And even though they were not very good at that, and that surprised some people, like you're not very accomplished in the game, you didn't get a lot of cool gear, and you're kind of just messing about. But it's a game, it's supposed to be about the challenge, right? And what they forgot was that this was the virtual place where people hung out with each other, where they built and maintained relationships, where they shared their lives with each other. So those things, those kind of communities with those human to human connections drive engagement and stickiness and user happiness like nothing else can, because at the end of the day, nothing is more interesting and engaging as another human being. The same kind of trust question as we saw in marketplaces are similarly important in on-demand services as well, because giving someone money and hoping that maybe something will show up, that's already kind of an act of trust, right? So chat has an influence on that. More than that, it also gives us a sense of control again. Like I remember when I lived in San Francisco, and this was quite a bit back in the day, before Uber was a thing, San Francisco taxis were absolutely horrible. If me and my girlfriend wanted to go out to a restaurant, we would dress up, wear nice shoes, call a taxi, and the phone central would tell us, we'll be there within 20 minutes. 20 minutes come, it turns to 30 minutes, 45 minutes. You call them, yes, it will be on its way. And 2 hours later, you're kind of ready to give up on your nights. So just that act of being able to communicate and connect and have a sense of what is going on makes a massive difference to people already. On top of that, whenever something does go wrong, then instead of blaming a corporation or an entity or this soulless, distant thing that is really easy to get angry at, we understand that we're talking to human beings. When you text someone in your delivery app, it's another human being connecting back at you. And we understand that stuff happens with other human beings. We have empathy and sympathy for them. And we find that changes the cancellations in these on-demand services by up to 30%. And that's a massive big deal, because cancellations are expensive, because you often still have to pay the delivery driver or the restaurant and all these other things, even though you have no money coming in. So it's not just a lost transaction, it's a loss transaction. And that is something you want to avoid. So all those things combined show the power of those kind of integrations, I think. Now, finally, something that I think most of you or all of you have experienced as well is just how exciting it is to experience things as a group. Whenever you're going to a concert or a soccer game or football game, depending on which continent you live on, being part of that crowd that goes wild and feels that passion, oh my God, that is one of the best experiences ever, right? So being able to share experiences is something that makes our human brain incredibly happy. Now, the digital experience isn't 100% the same. We all know that. But if you look at what it feels like to watch a YouTube movie versus watching a live sporting or music event with other people with live chats, suddenly a lot of that becomes that live experience with other people again. And when you see all these messages scrolling by at a high volume as someone wins in their esports game or scores a goal, it brings so much of that experience back to you again. Finally, and this is a very real one for a lot of people, especially these days, healthcare is a very obvious one as well, right? Like if you look at the importance of trust and feeling listened to and taken seriously is probably nowhere more important as it is in healthcare. So all the things that we just talked about, all the lessons that we have learned are incredibly important there as well. So the last thing I wanted to look at, and I hope that this kind of gave you a good overview of why these things matter and why they matter so much to your users and why it could be interesting for you to try them out as well. So I figured it'd be good to show you just how simple it can be to get up and running. Now, the first thing I wanted to show you guys is something that I just spun up this morning. If you go to chatsamples.com, you can see what we call an open channel chat environment for Sendbird. There you go. So if you go to that location, it's without the /chat, Jason. That's the link. Test, it works. Yes, it does. So this is a relatively easy environment. And one of the things that you'll notice is that there are no ways to respond with emojis, or there's no typing indicators. Hello, other Chris. And that is because this is the type of environment where thousands of people can join. One of the things that Sendbird does, which I personally absolutely love, is that with these kind of channels, you can support up to 20, 30,000 people. We could even set up a dedicated server for you when it supports up to 60,000 people. But you never want to be in a chat environment where you see 60,000 people typing, because there's no way you can keep up with that, right? So one of the things that Sendbird does is that it auto partitions these people into groups of 2,000, which is more than enough to get a sense. Yes, live chat, and you can see yourself on the screen, which of course is always fun. So 2,000 people was more than enough to give you that sense of that shared emotional experience without it becoming a problem and scrolling by so fast that it will crash your computer or your phone. So that is the kind of experience you're looking at here. It's relatively minimal, but it can scale up like you would not believe it. Now, if you want to build something like this, yes, logos work as well. If you want to build an experience like this, I would recommend going to sendbird.com/docs. We've got documentation for all our different products. We've got chats, calls, desk, and UI kits. Now, today we're looking at chats, and specifically, I'm going to use the JavaScript solutions for this. But we've got support for all the other different languages that you might be interested in, including .NET, iOS, Android, Unity. So if you go to the JavaScript page, this will give you a whole bunch of sample webs that you can use. And I'll show you what that looks like in just a moment. So when you want to spin up one of those sample webs, you register as a user, you create an account in the dashboard, and then you create an application. And I'm going to call this Dev Week, because it is Developer Week, isn't it? I am personally located in Europe, so I'm going to choose Frankfurt, Germany. But as you can see, we've got data center locations all over the globe to make sure that every user gets a very fast experience. Because with chats, every millisecond does matter. If it's like 20, 30, 200, 300 milliseconds before a typing indicator shows up, then it almost feels like way back in the day when I was younger, and you can tell that was a little while ago by the receding hairline. I remember when you called America from Europe, it would take like 3 or 4 seconds to get a response back from someone. And that made a conversation so incredibly annoying and awkward. The same is true in chat as well. If you fully want to get that human-to-human connection sense, latency matters. So we're going to create an application. It always depends a little bit on how fast these things are, on what the server is doing at the moment. But this wasn't too bad. So I'm going to take this application ID, which is the only thing that we need right now to get up and running. And you'll see here, I've got a Visual Studio Code open. And if you look at our JavaScript repo in GitHub, you'll see there's a UI kit examples, and UI kits are pre-built components that allow you to get up and running in seconds instead of having to build your own experience. Now, if you want to build your own UI experience completely from scratch, we have the SDKs you can connect to. You get everything that Sendbird provides, including moderation, filtering, image moderations, HIPAA compliance, GDPR compliance, and all those other things you never want to build yourself. But you can plug into that as a backend, build your own front end. However, if you're the kind of person that goes, I want to build an application quickly and add chat to it, and I don't have weeks to spend, you are going to love UIKit. Because once you've got this checked out, everything is already built in. The only thing you have to say is, I'm going to change the application ID to the thing that I just copied. I'm going to save that. And then I'm going to do npm start. I have already done an npm install because no one wants to watch a session where someone has to install npm packages, right? So I skipped over that part for you. Now, as you can see, it is loading up, and bam, we've got a fully available chat environment. You will see that at the moment it's empty. So we're going to go to users here and create a few of those. Normally, when you build an application, you would connect your own user registration system and automatically register them with Sendbird as well, so that all your users have this integrated experience. Bulletin board system, IRC chats. Yes, I used to work with those, David. I've built quite a few IRC bots back in the day. So you can imagine I'm enjoying the heck out of this. It's far more modern and more fun to work with. So normally you wouldn't have to create these users. I am going to do that right now because we don't have that front end to connect to. Now, if I load this up again and I poof, now I've got a user I can invite. Bam, now we can chat. And as you can see, this didn't take more than, what, 2 minutes, and that was talking. Now, in this environment, you get a one-to-one experience that we were talking about previously. So you can edit your messages. Whenever someone is typing, you will see the typing indicator. There's a delivery indicator. You'll see what messages are new. All those social cues will be in this example because this is built for one-to-one or maybe group chats with like up to 100 people, but not for the super large thousands of people hanging out with each other. So that is how you can customize these experiences in your own application. Now, that is pretty much it as far as what I wanted to show you guys today. If you could show, thank you, Goku. Sandbird for president. I don't think I'm ready for that yet, but I appreciate that. So if you guys have any questions, now is the time to ask. I'll see your questions both in the Sandbird chat as well as the chat in the session here. My colleague Jason Koo is here as well. He's been sharing links throughout our talk. He's a developer advocate with me in the company, and he knows a lot of stuff. He's been here way longer than I have. So what do you guys think? Anything we can help with? Say hello to your cat. Hello. Yeah, she's ignoring me, but she's a cat, you know. Psychoacoustics. Oh my goodness. That is a very different kind of question. It influences things absolutely. And the reason for that is that the closer you come to the full real life experience, the more your brain gets tricked into believing that it's the real deal. And the more that a sound sounds modified by the carrier, then your brain understands that there's some extraction going on there. That's the shortest answer I can give you to that question. It matters a little bit, but I would encourage you to try things like the Sandbird voice chats, which is very high quality, or even just calling someone with FaceTime audio instead of a phone line. And you'll see that those codecs, so sorry, are already far better than you would get on normal phone lines. So you can definitely experiment with this right now. Any other questions? Of course, Douglas. I guess that is it. Well, guys, last thing that I will talk to you about is that at Sandbird, we love talking to developers and people who are building cool applications, sometimes using Sandbird, sometimes using other things. And we have our Code Cafe sessions where we invite interesting people over to talk code. So if you're interested in attending some of these, scan that QR code with your phone and you'll go to the registration page. So does the messaging have a way to encrypt, avoid censorship if people want to use it in China? Well, I cannot comment officially on the China bit because that involves lawyers and local legislation rather than technical solutions. So is it possible to encrypt messages and send them to people in a way that avoids automatic censorship? Absolutely. Like one of the oldest tricks that people have used in the past is that you can encode messages into JPEGs or GIFs or into movies. And there's no way to see it because the bits that make up the 8 bits that define a character are just mixed in as undetectable noise in the image itself. And as long as you use the same encryption keys to encode and decode that, you can get the message out of it. If you do not have that codex, it just looks like a normal image. So there are massive amounts of creative ways in which you could avoid censorship if that's the legal thing that you want to do. I hope that does help to answer your question a little bit, Yuan. Any other questions? I will take that as a no. Well, it was, oh, people are distracted by texts. Any ideas on how to limit or leverage that effect? I would say it's not necessarily text, although text is distracting. The thing that happens in our brain is that we instinctually pay attention to things that move. And that makes sense, right? Like if you look at human beings living on the plains with predators around them, moving objects are the most interesting things to pay attention to. So moving text is very interesting. If you don't want people to be distracted, make sure that everything is static and they'll automatically avoid it. Anyway, thank you for the great questions, Bill. I'm glad you enjoyed the talk. And if you want to get in touch, make sure to reach out to us in our community site, which is community.samber.com. You guys have a great rest of the conference and day. Take care, guys.